Matt Lenihan for Boxing Social in association with William Hill and Empire Fight Store. Always a pleasure to be joined by Dan Rafael, who's there in Las Vegas. I wish I was, but for Canelo, Jermell Charlo. First off, Dan, I just wanted to ask, what's the feeling been like around this fight? Has they got that big fight feel like it has for many Canelo fights?
I think so. I mean, maybe it's not on the level of, say, when he fought some of the absolute biggest, Floyd Mayweather fight, for example, or, even the Caleb Plant fight when he became undisputed. But look, there's, you feel it when you walk into the hotel at the MGM. Signages everywhere. There's already some fans here. I got here on Wednesday morning in time for the press conference. For most fights, you don't really get the true feel often till Friday when they have the weigh-in. I'm sure that when the weigh-in takes place and you see a huge amount of people gathered in front of the T-Mobile Arena in the plaza, for the ceremonial weigh-in, there'll be a ton of people there cheering on both guys, and people will realize this is a big event. So, it's a big event. I mean, it's very rare, by the way, since the building opened, that the T-Mobile Arena has hosted as many as 3 boxing events in one calendar year. This is a year where they're doing that. You had Tank and Ryan fight in April in T-Mobile Arena. You had Errol Spence and Terrence Crawford in July, and now Canelo against Charlo. So that's a big deal. I mean, and it's a big fight.
What do you make of Jermell Charlo's demeanour this week? I've seen some of the scrum interviews he's done in the press conference, and he said people sort of question him, and he goes, maybe I'm not like as amped up. I don't have my rowdy ass brother around, kind of thing. But how do you sort of, see him and sort of his energy? Because this is the biggest fight of his career, bar none. And he seems to have taken to it well. He seems very calm. What do you make of it?
Well, I mean, I had a chance to talk to him a little bit on Wednesday after the press conference with some of the other reporters. And I mean, I've known Jermell pretty much and his brother since they turned pro and started fighting on, way deep on undercards and have made their way up the ranks. And, being honest, you'd see them at fights. And I always got along fine with both guys. I mean, never had any issue with either one of them. I kind of liked them. I kind of understood that a lot of what they did to kind of get attention was a little bit of that was just sort of a shtick. Like they were just sort of trying to drum up attention for themselves. I never looked at them as like bad guys or anything, but they always would be like, rowdy and making noise and causing a little bit of a ruckus and that kind of thing. But the Jermell Charlo I have seen both in interviews and in the lead up to this fight on like All Access on Showtime, and then seeing how he acted at the news conference, and then getting a chance to kind of assess the body language, if you will, and speak to him a little bit in person on Wednesday. I think he's relaxed. I mean, I think he's excited. He knows it's a big fight for him. He has a chance to make significant boxing history. He is the undisputed champion in the junior middleweight division. He has a chance to become the undisputed champion in the super middleweight division. That's a big deal no matter what number of belt era you're fighting in. As it turns out, in the 4-belt era, there's never been a male boxer other than Terrence Crawford to be undisputed in 2 weight classes. Terrence, of course, did it at 140, and then recently against Spence at 147. And Jermell Charlo can join that group of guys. He's kind of playing with house money in a sense, because if he does lose, a lot of people say, well, okay, he went up 2 weight classes. He lost to the all-time great Canelo Alvarez, and he can, if he wants to return to junior middleweight where he still has, he'll still have 3 of the belts.
What do you make of his chances as the fight grows near? I remember when this fight first get made, a lot of people were talking about the weight difference. And I think it is important to say that, look, they are weight classes for a reason. But Jermell always comes across to me, I don't know about you, as a big dude anyway. And I know that doesn't always transfer up. But as the fight's getting closer now, how do you see this fight? How do you see this fight meshing?
Well, first of all, whatever his weight class has been that he's boxed in, he is a larger human being than Canelo Alvarez. I saw them next to each other at the press conference. I saw them, a couple inches away from, myself when I saw them after the press conference to speak to them. And, he is a bigger guy than Canelo. But of course, the thing is, Canelo has been fighting in the heavier weight divisions for a long time. So he's used to taking the heavier punches because he fought for many years as a middleweight. He has now fought for the last, few years as a super middleweight. So to me, that's what people sometimes mean about being a bigger guy. It's not so much that you're the larger person. It's that when you're in the boxing ring, you're more used to being hit by fighters that are going to be a little bigger or much bigger, frankly. But when the fight was made, I didn't think it was a mismatch joke and it was a complete blowout like a lot of people thought because of the 2 weight class situation that we're talking about. I always, and I'm not saying they're the same thing, but I mean, I covered the heyday of all the big Manny Pacquiao fights, and I can remember people thinking about what it was going to be like when Manny went from welterweight to fight, and he was a small welterweight, obviously, and he went up and he was challenging Antonio Margarito for a junior middleweight title. Now, they made the contract for that fight, as my recollection is 150 pounds, and Margarito, had to kind of make an accommodation to come down a few pounds. But the thing is, when Manny weighed in for this fight for the junior middleweight title, he only weighed like 144 pounds or something like that. He was way below the weight limit. And he was a much, much smaller guy than Margarito. And what did he do? He went in there and he beat the absolute living shit out of Margarito and broke his face, and was looking to the referee like telling him you should stop this fight because he gave such just an absolute beating to Margarito, and the fight probably should have been stopped. So anyway, the point is that those weight classes are created for a reason. But if you have the talent and you have the skills, it's there's nothing that you can't do, I guess, within reason. And going from 154 being the size of a man that Charlo is to fight a Canelo is not out of the realm of possibility. Now, all that said, it's very, very difficult not to think that Canelo wins the fight, particularly seeing how he's acting, his body language, talking about how much better he feels now that his surgically repaired wrist is now, he says, has not given him, it's not giving him problems now. He said it did give him problems over the last, going back to the Caleb Plant fight. So that's 4 fights that he's had problems. Caleb Plant, Dimitri Bivol, the Golovkin third fight, and then the John Ryder fight. He says for the first time since before the Plant fight that wrist and that hand are 100%. So, if that's true and the way he's talking, then I would think Charlo's probably in some big trouble.
Let's just sort of switch this up a bit. So, DAZN. Now, I remember when Eddie Hearn came to America, there's that famous interview, pay-per-view is dead, etc., what everyone said. But he keeps saying, no, I said pay-per-view was dead at that price point. So, in the UK, as part of the subscription, Charlo, Canelo is part of it. For you guys in the US, on top of your yearly, I think you said, is it $200 and something subscription? How much is this fight to get on DAZN on top of?
Well, this fight is not available on DAZN in the United States. In other parts of the world, it's on DAZN, which they announced. So, for example, if you were in the UK, it's part of your regular subscription. Here in the United States, as a Showtime pay-per-view, it is available on Showtime pay-per-view, as well as some other digital outlets, ppv.com, the Fight app. But, so it's not on, you don't have to have a subscription to Showtime to buy the fight. But if you do have a subscription, like most, diehard boxing fans do in this country, and even if you don't, you got to pay extra for the fight. Here, it's like $85, $84.99. And that's the same price as the Spence fight, same price as the Ryan Garcia and Tank Davis fight. And that's for one night of fights. It's a lot of money for a lot of people. So, but I think, honestly, Matt, most people who are boxing fans understand that for that type of fight, for a Tank and Ryan fight, for the biggest fights, they don't object to a pay-per-view. They understand it. They get it. We're so conditioned after, what's pay-per-view been going on since like the, in the true fashion that it has been, since like the early 90s or even the late 80s, that we know that for the biggest possible events, pay-per-view is what is unfortunately here. Now, I don't think the price point is very good. I mean, it should maybe be a little lower, at least. And they wonder why there's so much piracy. And on top of that, what is the more aggravating factor is when a company, and it doesn't matter if it's DAZN or Showtime or Top Rank with their ESPN pay-per-views, any of the companies that do pay-per-view events, is when they put something on pay-per-view that's like maybe a pretty good fight, but it just doesn't reach the level in your normal boxing fan's mind is that it's something super premium. And DAZN is seeing a lot of pushback right now, not because it's a bad fight, it's actually a very good fight, but they are confused and don't understand why this is a pay-per-view when that's why DAZN exists. And I'm talking about the recently announced fight between Regis Prograis defending his junior welterweight title against Devin Haney. Very good matchup, 2 quality fighters. But when you hear that that's a pay-per-view, you scratch your head and you wonder, why in the hell am I paying $20 a month or so, or $240 for the year for a DAZN subscription? And that's on pay-per-view, but I get a piece of shit like Josh Catterall against Jorge Linares as a main event.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that's no indictment of Jack Catterall, but to have Jorge Linares in a supposed premium main event is kind of a disgrace. But yet a fight like Haney and Prograis goes pay-per-view. That's where people have the problem. Not that a fight is pay-per-view.
What have you heard the rumblings in America about the Showtime situation then? Because we're seeing a lot online about Showtime potentially coming out of boxing and only doing, potentially, and I say rumored because I've not seen, unless something's come out since I've been driving back from my job earlier, that this is concrete, that they will only put on like maybe a premium pay-per-view and they'll be coming out of everything else. What have you heard from that side?
Well, that there's those rumors, if you will, have been rampant for a while. I'll say this: the people that put things out on their social media who proclaim to know every detail don't know shit. They just don't. I mean, they extrapolate, they fantasize, they make things up. And what's disheartening is to see a number of people that are somehow, some reason why actually rooting for the failure of Showtime, for them to go out of the business, which makes no sense. And that's because they've got a bug up their ass because maybe they don't like PBC for some reason. All I know is that it's never good when one of the top companies in the sport who put on the biggest fights, by the way, and that's not disputed because the 3 fights that are the biggest fights this year between Canelo and Charlo, as well as the previously fights I mentioned between Spence and Crawford and Hank and Ryan, those are all PBC fights. So, but again, there's nothing concrete about that. I'm here. I spoke to some of the Showtime people yesterday, including Steven Espinoza, and they're getting ready. They claim to announce some more fights for the end of this year. Another one of them will be a pay-per-view that is, again, not settled 100%, and that's between David Benavidez and Demetrius Andrade. The date on hold within the pay-per-view industry is November 25th. The reason it has not been announced, from what I am told, is because they don't have a site yet for the fight. Las Vegas, none of the main venues here in this city are available, so they're looking for another venue to place the fight, and they don't want to announce until they know exactly where it's going to take place. And there'll probably be at least 1 or 2 other events on Showtime from what the Showtime people have said. Now, what happens in 2024, that's up in the air. And it's not because the reason is because the company, Paramount, which is their parent company, is going through a huge amount of things. What happens now for those of us who live and die with every little thing in boxing? You know, it's the center of our world in many respects. For a large company like Paramount, it's like the 12th thing on the to-do list. They just sold a huge publishing company, Simon and Schuster. They're trying to sell BET, which is a big cable television network. You know, hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars. So what happens with, and also dealing with Showtime as the overall network. So what's going on with their boxing programming, that little franchise within the franchise is like a blip on their radar. So for us, it's like we want to know yesterday what the hell is going on, but they're going through their process. And I think there's a lot of people at Showtime. I know this for a fact because I talked to them. They're concerned. They don't know for sure. They don't know if something happens and boxing does go out, if they're going to have jobs in a few months. And there's also the thing that has been rumored. And I think part of it's because of what happened here in the United States when the PBC deal with Fox Network went out, which is the last year of that contract. They did no fights on the television linear other than on the night of a pay-per-view. They put on a few preliminaries to kind of lead into the pay-per-view. And the last year of that contract was only like 4 or 5 pay-per-view events. And so I think some people are taking that and thinking, okay, if Showtime goes out, maybe they'll follow suit with that. Now, the problem with that is for a couple of years, they would have enough inventory to do big enough fights on pay-per-view that would probably still draw audiences, with Canelo, who still has 2 fights after Saturday on his PBC contract, with fighters like Terrence Crawford, who I guess is still with them for another fight, or Spence when he comes back, or Tank Davis, those types of fighters, David Benavidez, etc. Perhaps the Deontay Wilder fight if he works with them again. But the problem is the pay-per-view fights, they become pay-per-view fights because the network spends time developing the fighters on the regular platform. So fans are introduced to them, see some fights of theirs, and want to see more of them. And then the biggest matchups are made, then they move them over to pay-per-view. If you lose the network aspect of that, how are those future pay-per-views being built? So the notion that it's going to be pay-per-view only, it can exist, it seems to me, for, I don't know, a handful of fights, but they'll peter out. And then where the next star is coming from. Right now, though, it seems to me, and that's taken the temperature of people like Steve Espinoza and others at Showtime, who I have talked to since I have been here, is that they tell me they just don't know for sure what's going on, and that rumors of their demise, are neither, they're not necessarily false, but they're not necessarily true. I think everybody's just got to sit back and wait and see what happens.
Why do you think it is?
God forbid, right? God forbid we wait a few minutes, a day or two, a week or two, to see what's going to happen.
Why do you think it is that you get some people that maybe, I don't want to say revel in it, but we've seen HBO come and go. You know, the legendary broadcasts we had over the years. Showtime who've set record after record on that pay-per-view stretch out there. You know, I think they've got 6 of the top 10 fights. You know, it should be like, we shouldn't be celebrated. But you see people online and it's like, why is this a good thing? Like,
Because there's always a segment of people that revel in other people's failures because they've got miserable lives of their own, and they derive happiness from the misery of others. And that's a sad commentary. And it seems to be something that is prevalent among a certain segment of people who follow boxing. I won't even call them boxing fans, because if you're a fan of boxing, you would never root for the demise of a quality property.
100%. Well, look, on a more positive note, we sort of half touched on the fight earlier, but Devin Haney, Regis Prograis, what a fight. Devin Haney, once again, you know, Lomachenko, Kambosos back-to-back, bouncing into this one now for another world title. And obviously you commend Regis as well, because he wants this fight. What a terrific fight for obviously the diehard boxing fans, and you know, a great fight to make. I think it's been a pretty good year for boxing in terms of fights getting made.
Yeah, there's no question. I mean, putting aside the disappointment that fight will be on DAZN as a pay-per-view, just in terms of the actual match, it's a very good, interesting fight. I mean, Devin Haney has proven himself to be the #1 lightweight in the world. He's undisputed, or now he's got 3 of the belts because the BC made him a champion in recess. But obviously, he's the #1 guy with what he has done over the last period of time. And he's not a guy that's ducking tough fights. I see people saying, well, he's fighting Regis, but, you know, he ducked Teofimo Lopez or he ducked Shakur Stevenson. I'm like, what are you talking about? You can only fight one guy at one time. Lopez is not even decided if he's going to fight this year, what he's doing. You know, he's a champion and he's a hell of a fighter, but that fight really wasn't legit. And, you know, Shakur, that would have been a fine fight, but he's going to fight for that title that the WBC put him in recess, because he wants to fight for another belt in another weight class. By the way, the same way Shakur is going to be fighting for a world title in his 3rd weight class. And I can remember back when Matchroom Boxing first signed Devin, you know, several years ago. This was near the beginning of the DAZN project, doing a press conference where they announced his signing here in Las Vegas, and I was out here for some other big fight. And even at that press conference years ago, they were talking about Devin in particular, about how, you know, he doesn't know how much longer he's going to be at lightweight. So he wants to win it. This before he was a champion. Let me win a world title and I'll see what happens. But, you know, I'm probably moving up in the not too distant future. And then, well, he ended up making a bunch of defenses, becoming undisputed. The guy's been making 135 pounds since he's like a kid. He's now a grown man. It's time to go up. He's not ducking anybody. That's absurd. He's taking on Prograis. It's one of the best 140-pounders in the world. You can't tell me you're ducking these other fighters in smaller weight classes if you're going up to take on a really quality champion in a higher weight class.
I feel like Devin's one of them fighters for years now. He seems to have gotten a bit of stick, as everyone does, a bit of criticism. But when you look at what he's actually been asking for and then what he's getting, I don't see where the criticism come from. I remember he was stood outside saying, he was in Ryan Garcia's face going, you're calling out Tank, but you're manager for my belt. Let's go, let's do it. And then Ryan, can't blame him for trying to get the Gervonta fight. Gervonta's big money, but he'd ask him for fights. Like, he's literally saying, give me the fights. And his body, if we're all being honest, I mean, the Shakur fight, I think that can still happen down the line, because Shakur's going to
go. Of course.
But now, Devin's body, I think, especially like in the first Kambosos fight, you could see him on the scales and his eyes, you know,
no question,
screaming for him to move up. So I don't think anyone can blame him for that. And Regis Prograis is world-class operator. I mean, didn't really show it in the last fight as much, but still a great fight.
And the other thing about Devin and what he's done, he's sort of in some ways followed in the footsteps of what Floyd Mayweather did, what Canelo has done in the recent past, is he's not doing these big long-term deals. When his contract with Matchroom was up, you know, he listened to different people, what was out there. He ended up making the decision to do a short-term agreement with Top Rank and Lou DiBella to get the Kambosos fight. Was well paid for those 2 fights. Then, of course, was very well paid for the Lomachenko fight, and that was up. And now he's got the opportunity in free agency to do what he wants to do. So we talked again with Top Rank about what was out there, and I guess talked with Matchroom and to see what was going on. And him and his father, Bill Haney, who was also his trainer and manager, weighed their options, like the prospect of a Prograis fight, and opted to do that. He's going to be well compensated. My understanding is to make probably at least $4 million for that fight. As the challenger, he's going to make more money than Regis Prograis, who's got the title. So good for him. And here's another thing about it, by the way. And I'm not sure if this was part of Devin Haney's thought process, but it wouldn't shock me if it was, because he's very intelligent about what goes on in the business of boxing. I'm going to tell you right now, if he wins the fight against Regis Prograis, he's puts himself in a very strong position to be the fighter of the year, which is a big deal because that will give him a victory against Vasily Lomachenko and a victory against Regis Prograis. You tell me another elite fighter who would have 2 wins against that level of guy in 1 calendar year. Okay, it's not going to be, let's say Canelo wins. You're not going to give him that much credit because he beat Ryder, right? If Charlo wins, it's a huge win, but it's only 1 fight in the calendar year. Now, he might still get it because it's such a huge victory. But again, he fought 1 time. You look at the guys in the heavyweight division, Joshua fought 2 lesser guys. Deontay didn't fight. Tyson Fury's going to fight, Ngannou. That's not going to give him a fighter of the year type of thing. You just go on down the weight classes and see who puts themselves in the picture for fighter of the year. And I think that Haney, I'm not saying there's not others that would be considered, but he clearly, if he wins against Regis, would put himself in a tremendous position to be the fighter of the year.
For me, I think when you look at fighter of the year, I know everyone talks as well, and rightly so, about Inoue, the monster Inoue, and how he's stepping up in weight with the power. But like you just
mentioned, for sure,
the level of opposition which Devin's operating at, and the fact that he's stepping up in weight, he is challenging.
But I'm going to tell you though. So if let's just take for an argument. Again, I'm not, everybody's going to be entitled to their opinion. So in Inoue, it certainly would be a candidate if he wins his next fight. He would have beaten Stephen Fulton to, having stepped up. He will have beaten Stephen Fulton to win 2 of the belts at junior featherweight. And if the fight's going to get done, as a matter of fact, I was talking to one of the representatives from Marlon Tapales just last night here in the casino. The fight's not done yet, but it's going to get done for like late December, is what I was told. And so he will fight Tapales, and the 2 of them will vie for the undisputed title at junior featherweight. If Inoue wins that fight, which of course will be a humongous favorite, I'm not sure if victories against Fulton and Tapales trump victories against the fighters the caliber of Lomachenko and Prograis. The accomplishment will be impressive because he would become undisputed in a way in 2 different weight classes. Yeah. Haney, is not going to do that accomplishment. He's already done it at lightweight, but the names, the opponent, to me, what's more important is who you're beating. And to me, beating Prograis and Loma is a bigger deal than beating Fulton followed by Tapales. That's my opinion, but I could see that. But I'm just making the point that for anybody that's saying that Haney's ducking this or ducking that, he's taken on a bona fide quality world champion. He's moving up in weight to do it. He's making his own deals, getting paid a shitload of money for it, and is putting himself in position for one of those important lines on your Hall of Fame resume, which is to possibly, again, not done, but possibly to be named and elected and voted or whatever, picked as the 2023 Fighter of the Year.
Yeah, I think he's really, you mentioned it earlier, he's taken that sort of Floyd Mayweather blueprint, but he's done it earlier in his career and just run to the hills with it. Very clever the way he's done it. Look, I'm going to keep you too much long, but I think it's important to touch on this. We mentioned it off camera. The sad news, obviously, the passing of Colonel Bob Sheridan, legendary Hall of Fame announcer, everyone from Muhammad Ali, the list goes on and on. The accolades are endless. Just from someone who's been in the sport a long time, Dan, just give us your fond memories on what was, obviously it's a tragic passing.
Well, I had a very, very close relationship with the Colonel for most of my career. I mean, when I first started out, most of the Colonel's broadcasting gigs were doing the Don King cards. And I would see him at a lot of those fights, and I got to know him, and we hung out. I mean, would have breakfast with him and just shoot the shit and joke around. He was just a very, just a friendly person, a bigger than life personality. And it got to a certain point where, he would read my material, and I knew so much, like he used to call me like Rain Man because I knew like so many details about the different fighters. And King would put on these championship cards with like 5 and 6 and 7 world title fights. And Colonel's like trying to do all of his homework to get ready for the broadcast. I used to sit with him in the press room at some of these events and sort of like go over some of the background of some of these fighters with him, just to he would ask me, can you help me out? And it got to a point where it became a joke between the 2 of us because he had announced he was closing in on having announced 1,000 world championship fights. In total fights, he probably announced like 10,000 fights. He started in like the 1960s. But in terms of just the major world title fights of what eventually became the 4 sanctioning bodies, he did 1,000+ world title fights. But as he was closing in on the record, I would keep the list for him. I'd be like, Colonel, when you do the fights this week, you're gonna be up to like 981. You'll be up to 994, whatever it was. So he's a joke around. He would like go through and he would find like his old score sheets, and we would like run them to see how. We never figured out exactly. We're definitely off by a few here and there, But the point was, he's definitely over 1,000 world title fights. And the joke between us for many, many years was like I was the official keeper of how many fights he announced in terms of the world title fights. They started to come slower and slower over the last several years as he was doing less broadcasting. He was doing a little more MMA and that kind of thing. And but he announced a ton of fights. I mean, look, when I was a younger guy, I remember the HBO announce call of when Mike Tyson got knocked out by Buster Douglas, the very famous call done by Jim Lampley, Larry Merchant, and Sugar Ray Leonard on HBO. But a lot of people after that and around the rest of the world definitely know the Colonel's call of that, which was a brilliant call of Buster knocking out Tyson. They know it better than the Lampley call because that's the one that you see that's played in reruns on like ESPN's networks now that they have the rights to that. It's not the HBO call. So the Colonel has been seen around the world for decades doing these huge fights. And now even in the United States over the last number of years, because a lot of the replays are those international calls, they know his voice also. He is voiced. I mean, there's not a single superstar champion that he's not announced in some form or fashion, either domestically in America or certainly internationally. I mean, a famous figure all around broadcasting circles within boxing is certainly Australia, New Zealand, probably least known in the United States compared to all the other countries. And one of my fondest memories in boxing is after Larry Merchant left HBO, he still did some commentating, and Top Rank had hired him to work on an event in Orlando, Florida, where Miguel Cotto was the main event. He was coming off a loss, and they were rebuilding him. And the Colonel was doing a lot of the Top Rank shows at that time. This is before they had their ESPN deal. So that Miguel Cotto fight was on HBO, but the Colonel was doing the international like he did for gazillions of fights. And they hired Larry to work with the Colonel on the call. Now, Larry and the Colonel had sat ringside next to each other practically, or right, Larry in front, the Colonel right behind doing international, Larry doing the United States domestic. So Larry and the Colonel had known each other for like 40 years probably, and had been friendly, but had never called a fight together. So this was sort of like, a thing where you got these two like iconic broadcasters who are going to work a fight together. And the morning of that fight in the hotel in Orlando, I had breakfast with Larry and the Colonel because Larry has been one of my best friends in boxing, for almost 25 years. And so I was so like enamored with the conversation that we had. I said, guys, do you mind? I'm going to go back to my room and I'm going to write a column about this because this has been such a fucking great breakfast. Hearing you guys go back and forth about your backgrounds and different, not just boxing, but, Larry having covered, football and baseball, and the Colonel having called college football games and basketball games and all kinds of stuff. And I wrote this piece, I wasn't planning it. It's just so many good things to write off of that breakfast. And I did write that piece. And then later that night, actually, they called the fight together. And, and even when Colonel wasn't doing fights on a regular basis, he would call me, I would call him. We would, not like every day, but I mean, we were always in touch, once a month, maybe every 6 weeks, maybe a couple times a week, depending what was going on in the sport, just to shoot the shit. He always had grand plans, like there was some other big event that he was going to work on. So he would call me and tell me. Now, some of them did not end up happening, but he always had like the enthusiasm for the sport. But one thing that always stuck with me, because he would get on my case because, I would kind of get on the case of certain things with the sanctioning bodies, for example. And the Colonel would go soft on them when he would talk about them in his commentary. And he would always say, "You're the journalist. I'm an entertainer." He never said, he goes, "I'm not paid to say bad stuff about anybody in boxing. You are a columnist. That's your job to call people out or to speak truth to power, whatever. I'm here to entertain the viewers who are watching me call these fights." And he made a distinction between what he did and what guys like me did. But the thing about it was, he was a very, very smart boxing guy, had an incredible history in boxing, knew everybody. Most everybody that I knew liked him. How many broadcasters can you say worked for many, many years with no problems for Don King and for Bob Arum? I mean, that's amazing unto itself. And I just love the guy. I mean, I know that he rubbed some people, maybe for some things he may have said maybe the wrong way a little bit. He kind of was very outspoken about a few things. But this is a guy, and I mean, this is the greatest Colonel story of all time. Now, I was not there for this, but on the night that Mike Tyson and Evander Holyfield fought, and Colonel, everybody knows him, he had a lot of heart problems. He had a lot of health problems. And I'll tell you right now that if the Colonel was still with us, he would say, "It's a miracle I'm still here." And if he could speak to us from wherever he is now, he would say the fact that I made it as long as I did is like a fucking miracle. He was having heart problems for many, many years. He basically had a heart attack before that, I forget if it was the first fight or the second fight between Evander and Tyson. He had checked himself into the hospital in Las Vegas. Against the doctor's orders, he left the hospital and went to call the fight at ringside, and the doctor came and sat behind him. He called the fight and then went back to the hospital. That's what a fucking lunatic, and I mean that in the most beloved way possible, that the Colonel was. And that's one story, maybe that's the most famous, but there are a fucking 1,000 Colonel stories like that, of his enthusiasm for the athletes, for the writers, for the promoters, for everybody in the business, for even the sanctioning body people, referees and judges. I mean, he just loved everybody in boxing. He, to me, was like the absolute epitome of when you say, oh, he's a character in boxing. The Colonel was a character in boxing, like no other that I have ever met.
Well, Dan, I think I'm sure obviously he'll be watching this somewhere, and you know, I'm sure he'd appreciate them kind words. So appreciate your time, Dan. I know that's a touching subject, but yeah, I think it's only right that we covered it. But look, I'm going to let you enjoy this week in Vegas now. A terrific fight this Saturday. Canelo Alvarez, Jermell Charlo. I'm hopefully going to stay up and be awake to see it. And we'll catch up soon. I appreciate your time as always, Dan.
You bet, Matt. Thank you so much.